And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Enterprise's Rachel Riley to get us started. Rachel?
Thanks so much, Donna, and thanks everyone for joining us again. This was a record registration for our Opportunity Zones webinar series here at Enterprise. We've had 1,400 plus folks register for this one, and just really excited that everyone's able to join us here in one of these last weeks of summer. There's been a lot of movement over the past couple months, a lot of activities, especially in the states, as states are reaching out, trying to engage stakeholders, as well as others to share information and understand what's coming as funds are announcing the formation and intent to start investing in communities. And at the same time, we're seeing some movement or projected movement on the federal level around implementation and questions and hesitancy around timing with that. So really what our hope today is to provide what we know on a comprehensive overview, so both what's happening on the Hill and the IRS regarding implementation, what we're hearing, where the questions still are, as well as the latest on which organizations, which fund managers and capital providers have started to begin to announce their intent to create opportunity funds, and as well as what other organizations have begun to announce support of these efforts and really begin to build out this ecosystem and emerging asset class, which it's been dubbed a new emerging asset class, which are opportunity fund investments. The last thing we hope to do is also talk about how states and cities are responding. And with that, we also have brought on Katie Kramer as our guest again today to talk about really what I think is groundbreaking intel and information regarding their state-of-the-state reports, where they have an inside view on how states are contemplating engaging with opportunity zones and what type of incentives and activities they are thinking about moving forward with. And lastly, we're going to turn it over to my colleague, Zach Patton, to run down some opportunity zone characteristics at a high level, what we're seeing as far as who lives in the opportunity zones, what neighborhood demographics and dynamics look like, as well as a demonstration of an update of our resource, which is the Opportunity Eligibility Map that was created back in February and widely used. We've now updated that to be useful in this new iteration and new time frame where folks are now done with the Opportunity Zone designation process, and hopefully the way that Zach and his team have built this out can be of use as we move forward. So with that, and what I do want to say is that we are going to have about 20 minutes, hopefully at the end, for Q&A. So there's going to be a lot of content in this slide deck, and the aim around that is that this is a document that we're going to be posting online. It's going to have a lot of hyperlinks that you can click on as a resource for later. So we're going to go through information pretty quickly in the interest of time, but hopefully this will be something that you can reference time and time again once it is posted and emailed out. Next slide, please. So for those joining us that may not be familiar with Enterprise, I do want to just do a quick overview of who we are and share a bit about how we've been engaging with Opportunity Zones. Enterprise is a national nonprofit, and our expertise really is around bringing together public and private sector partners to deliver capital, develop programs, and advocate for policies that are strengthening communities throughout the nation. Our engagement with Opportunity Zones, we were an early supporter of the Investing in Opportunity Act, which was the predecessor or the piece of legislation that really introduced this Opportunity Zones concept. And we supported that, and we supported it with, it had reporting requirements associated with it, and we could talk about that later on in the webinar about reinstating those reporting requirements and efforts to that end. But we were an early supporter of that because we saw the great potential in incenting private capital into distressed communities with certain guardrails as far as accountability and transparency. And as opportunity zones were enacted as part of tax reform, we this year have continued to work with key stakeholders on implementation, both at the national and local levels. Our CEO, Terry Ludwig, was invited to testify. She was one of 3 witnesses in front of the Joint Economic Committee back in May, providing expertise around our thoughts for proper implementation of opportunity zones. And a link to that can be found right there. And we have also been a national resource. So as I mentioned, that mapping tool, as well as our Opportunity Zones Guide, which I'm also excited to note that our new Opportunity Zones Guide has been released today. So that is on our website as well. This was something that we had done in early January and had not had an opportunity to update it. But a new revamped Opportunity Zones Guide is now available for folks on our website. And we also have local expertise. We have boots on the ground throughout the nation in markets on both coasts and throughout the middle of the country, as well as we have a great team of economic development experts through our advisory services team that together really everyone is providing technical assistance, building relationships, and executing on activities that are really delivering measurable impact. And really that footprint is about in 1/3 of opportunity zones nationwide. So we already have a presence and knowledge in opportunity zones as an organization already. And we're hoping to leverage that with our financial capabilities through our impact investment platform to create and support opportunity funds as we move forward here, and we'll discuss that further in the webinar as well. So where we are with implementation as of this month, and this is of course ever changing, but as most know, opportunity zones are now fully approved as of June. So all 50 states, 5 territories, and Washington, D.C. So everyone knows, 8,700 plus census tracts throughout the nation. Everyone knows which census tracts can now be eligible for investment. As far as guidance on opportunity funds, what we saw in April was IRS published their first round of FAQs for opportunity zones, and with that we received the information that opportunity funds were going to be able to self-certify so that there was going to be no approval needed prior to operating as an opportunity fund. And really with that, once you had your opportunity zones approved and you had the notification that you could self-certify as an opportunity fund, the thought was that the market could start forming and moving forward. And really that's what we saw as of June is opportunity funds beginning to launch and move forward, absent additional guidance, because they had those 2 pieces in place. A lot of other potential fund managers, potential investors are still awaiting additional guidance because there is clarity that we do need, and we'll go further into that on key pieces of how opportunity zones is going to function as a tax benefit or eligible investments and what the definition of those actually are. And so you do see some early movers moving forward, sticking very close to what the statute has outlined, and then you see others sort of taking a wait-and-see approach, awaiting this additional clarity given how they have planned to structure their fund model. The other thing we saw was in June, an additional round of FAQs from the IRS, and what we are hearing is that there's going to be a more robust FAQ or regulation proposed rule perhaps put forth later this year, maybe this fall, but we don't know. And so this full implementation of the law, it's still very unclear, and it's unclear about what form that will take. But of course, please continue to watch for our updates, and we'll continue to keep you in the loop as we learn more. Of course, state and local efforts are ongoing. We really urged public sector leaders in states, regions, and cities to, as soon as opportunity zones were submitted and approved, to really start beginning to engage communities, engage investors, start establishing frameworks and hosting convenings, to be thoughtful about building out an ecosystem and a playbook for what opportunity zones could look like for their communities. And we saw a lot of states and localities embrace that. It's been very exciting. And we're also seeing states and public sector leaders in cities and regions start thinking about how they may be offering additional incentives for opportunity zone funding, as well as how opportunity zone investment can be aligning with their existing sources of capital. And as I mentioned, the creation of and the investment in opportunity funds is ongoing. We already know that this is happening. And of course, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So the first part of implementation I want to talk about, these are sort of, what I think of as the hot topics. So transparency and guardrails. This is something we continue to hear about, something that during our testimony to the Joint Economic Committee, we underscored that the original intent of the policy really was to foster inclusive economic growth, as well as, the needed importance for alignment around local priorities and community needs. And so our recommendations during that hearing was that IRS needed to provide additional guidance and clarity for investors and fund managers to really help move the market forward in a way where everyone knew what the rules of the game were, and everyone was operating from the same playbook, and that through implementation, whatever rules were established really needed to promote transparency of opportunity fund activities in communities, and that the rules and regulations needed to ensure accountability and prevent abuse. And so we're seeing a lot of organizations, we're seeing some localities, jurisdictions start sending letters to Treasury. This really started happening back in February and March, and we're continuing to hear and see this happen. So these letters to Treasury have been around, touching on topics around the certification of opportunity funds. So like I mentioned, that self-certification doesn't require any initial approval from the IRS. And so folks are weighing in on that and whether or not there needs to be some additional checks and balances around that. Of course, reporting requirements remains a really important topic of discussion, and we're seeing that reiterated in these letters to Treasury. The importance of working with cities and states as well. So organizations like our organization, Enterprise, as well as National Housing Conference and LISC have submitted letters to Treasury. There's been the King County in Washington State has submitted a letter to Treasury, as well as the City of Austin. The City of Austin urged Treasury to craft regulations requiring investors to work with local stakeholders. And really where Austin is coming from is this theory that it's not that there's a lack of capital in the market, but it's really the right type of capital. And so investors need to be at the table with localities and with cities to understand what type of capital was needed in those communities. As well as we saw PolicyLink last week or the week before come out with guiding principles for opportunity zones and opportunity funds, and with that, a template letter that folks could look at and send to Treasury that basically ripped off those guiding principles. So I encourage everyone to go and look at those letters to Treasury if they're interested in understanding that content a little bit better. Next slide, please. Another hot topic, of course, are these reporting requirements. Something that I want to mention is that reporting requirements were always part of opportunity zones. They were included in the Investing in Opportunity Act, and even in the conference report for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or the tax reform bill, it was always assumed that there would be these reporting requirements associated with opportunity zones. What happened was that they were stripped from the final version of the legislation because of the Byrd Rule. And I do want to really quickly talk about this because I want to underscore that there was no level of disagreement on whether or not there should be reporting requirements. The Byrd Rule is basically, it's a parliamentary procedure that is part of the reconciliation process. And effectively what that means is that if a line item or if something doesn't have a revenue implication, it gets cut from the bill. And so reporting requirements, because it doesn't have a revenue implication, it just got cut from the bill. It wasn't that one side of the aisle disagreed with the reporting requirements, and so that's why it was eliminated. And in fact, as we continue to go around to the Hill and talk about the need to reinstate reporting requirements, we're getting support from both sides of the aisle about the need for some level of transparency around this, an initial baselining of where these investments are happening and continued monitoring of these communities and how investment is affecting these communities. It's just a real matter of how you implement that and how you ask opportunity funds to do that, what type of information they are providing to the IRS or providing to Treasury, and at what point they're doing that. And so you can look and see what the exact reporting requirements actually were on that link right there. And what our recommendation has been is that the IRS can leverage this certification process and this semi-annual deployment test. So all opportunity funds have to report to the IRS on deployment. So in order to meet the deployment test, the 90% deployed asset test, they have to be sharing with the IRS their investments. And so that's a real opportunity for the IRS to be collecting transaction level information that can then be potentially shared with the public, just certain data points that could be extrapolated to better understand what the impact is along the lines of these economic indicators that were originally included in the Investing in Opportunity Act and the conference report. So that's sort of how we're hoping this moves forward. But again, it's just something we've been messaging and talking about. And we're also seeing some additional efforts to facilitate that transparency and impact measurement. We're seeing cities and states talk about local requirements for opportunity funds. So whether or not, to the extent cities and states are thinking about offering additional incentives and funding to opportunity funds or investors, could they tie disclosures or disclosure requirements to those sources of funding or to those incentives that would then allow those cities and states to understand what investments are being made? That's not a catch-all, but that's at least a step in the right direction. And then you're seeing efforts to create shared frameworks to evaluate impacts of investments. So back in June, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Beck Center, and the U.S. Impact Investing Alliance convened a number of stakeholders to talk about creating a shared framework around impact investing. This would be something that opportunity funds would opt into, and really is to develop or discuss what that would look like and really underscore the need for transparency, community engagement, and wanting to engage a broader audience in that discussion and engaging additional stakeholders. So those are some efforts that are happening around reinstating those reporting requirements. Next slide. And then finally on implementation, what we're seeing around additional guidance. As I mentioned, there are some funds and fund managers that have decided to move forward, sticking very close to the statute. And then there are others that are asking the IRS for additional guidance. And I have a quote here from Treasury Secretary Mnuchin. Back in July, Congressman Rothfuss from Pennsylvania asked him during a hearing when we would see regulations for opportunity zones, and Secretary Mnuchin's response was soon. And when further pressed, soon then was explained to be by the end of the year. So again, we don't know what that looks like, but that's what the Secretary has said, is that additional guidance regulations would be provided by the end of the year. We don't know if that simply means, further definition around, and by gains, we mean capital gains, because that is one issue that is needed for clarification in the statute, or if that means, a very robust regulatory process. I'm sure it might be somewhere in the middle, but I just wanted to share that with everyone. There have been advocacy efforts from different parties on some key consensus issues around what type of guidance is really needed in the most near term in order to help with market formation and help spur investment immediately. And three of the top issues that I continue to hear about are outlined here and also in this hyperlink below. We further go into these issues in a blog post that we did recently, so I won't discuss them too much, but really it is around this clarity on certain definitions and terms within the statute, the revolving nature of funds and how the tax benefit is accrued. So sometimes it's called the interim gains issue, and really it's whether or not investors are accruing the benefit at the asset level or the fund level. So if they invest in a fund for 10 years, but that fund revolves capital into three different investments, they exit and reinvest that capital. Is that still a 10-year benefit that is accrued, or do they lose it because they've exited that investment multiple times? So again, more information on that blog. But then the third really is the length of time allowed for the deployment of the capital. So most folks know that investors have 180 days to put their capital into a fund, but then there still remains a question of, absent additional guidance, the understanding is that there's another 6 months before that capital has to be moved into an asset or deployed. But really what folks are looking for is clarity. Is it really 6 months before that deployment test is triggered and you're tested on that 90% deployment test, or do we have a longer runway? So again, 180 days, investor has to move their capital into a fund, but then how long does that fund have to move that capital into the market? Next slide. So this slide is just, I wanted to share what we're hearing as far as some emerging funds, and really want to underscore that the early movers, I think, are going to make the market. They're going to set the tone for what investors can expect, for what Congress and the administration really anticipates and can expect as far as what their standard for success looks like as far as impact and responsible deployment of opportunity zone capital. So just wanted to share some early announcements. This is in no way a comprehensive list. A lot of these are pulled from a recent article that Impact Alpha did that covered some of these strategies in more detail. So I'd point you over to Impact Alpha. Like I mentioned, Enterprise Community Partners is planning on doing a fund. We are partnering in another fund called the Rivermont Enterprise Emergent Communities Fund, and this is a partnership with Rivermont Capital Beekman Advisors, and that strategy really is around investing in main streets across small towns and rural areas in the Southeast. and it's aimed in entrepreneurship, small business, and skill development to really ensure that residents in those towns are prepared to either scale their business or launch a new business, or, lastly, we're providing the technical abilities to help train them for emerging jobs or jobs coming in through Opportunity Fund investments. So those are just a few that I wanted to share with you, some projects that we're hearing about. These are real estate projects, one in Maine, one in Washington, D.C. And then I wanted to also highlight some early movers that are helping to build the ecosystem. So a few folks on the phone may have responded to and most likely heard about efforts from Rockefeller Foundation and Kresge Foundation. They issued a RFP for LOI, or basically asked potential fund managers to respond to an RFP that would ask them, what's your strategy for an opportunity fund that really is focused on equity and a commitment to impact measurement. And the offer there is a $12 million in total support to help get those funds up and running, and so they had a very robust response to that LOI. So hopefully we'll hear the results of that soon. I know the folks at Rockefeller and Kresge are working really hard in evaluating the submissions to that, and like I said, I think they got quite a few responses to their solicitation on that. Another that I would like to really cite is Launch Tennessee and the great work that they're doing in Tennessee around providing capital and market access and just really helping to develop the entrepreneurship ecosystem in the state of Tennessee. They're also launching an impact fund, which is not necessarily an opportunity fund, but it could be used to support opportunity zone, either future investees, so help prepare them for opportunity fund investments one day, or it could be like a sidecar potential capital product. So I just think Launch Tennessee is doing really great work, and so as states are thinking about how they can be supporting their entrepreneur ecosystem, would encourage them to look at that. And then CDFIs are starting to look at how they can be working with stakeholders and evaluating their positions in the market. So I, again, would look at Community Lift, who's working in Memphis, who, they're saying, should we be a fund manager? Should we figure out how to provide some level of, alternative revenue generation models that help connect capital to deals, and maybe we're an asset manager, maybe we just help facilitate deal flow. And so these are sort of some best practices that I would point to. Next slide. And then for enterprise, I do want to share our plan for opportunity funds. We are very committed that the capital that we are going to be investing is going to be improving the well-being of residents and stimulating economic development. And we also have a strong commitment to transparency. So that means for us a strong commitment to impact reporting and measurement. And our strategy really is to create a platform of opportunity funds. So what that means for us is eventually a national opportunity fund. We'll be eventually creating regional opportunity funds, and we'll also be providing services for others. And so the reason that we think that that's important is because we know that the products, so the funds need to be available for investors to have options to invest in if we want to ensure that capital is flowing to high impact projects and entrepreneurs that may not be serviced by the traditional market. And so if there are funds out there that are maybe missing a piece and that is the barrier that is keeping them from moving forward with engaging with opportunity zones. And it just happens to be a core competency of enterprise because we've been doing this work for over 30 years. We think that there is a value add we can bring to the market. So whether that's through fund structuring or fund management, fund administration, asset management, advisory services to the public sector. So as states and cities think about how they want to plan for capital absorption or provide incentives or best position themselves in the market, that's something that our advisory services team has done for years. As well as reporting and evaluation of investments. That is something that our knowledge team, our KISS team, as we affectionately call them, is wonderful at. They're the team that helped and led the creation of our mapping tool, and that's the team that Zach is on, and he could talk more about that later. So all in all, we really think that by leveraging our local expertise and our network of partners with this financing expertise we built out over the past 30 years, we're going to be able to create a meaningful difference through opportunity zones that in aggregate will impact roughly about $1 billion over the next decade. So if you have any questions, we'd love to talk with you more about that and connect you up with the right folks here at Enterprise, whether it's about deals or maybe you're a fund that could benefit from one of these services. We're really interested in understanding where the gaps are in service provision. So definitely be in touch. Next slide. This is something I get asked a lot about, how the capital is potentially going to be used. And so I'm just sharing what I'm hearing. I don't know to what extent this is going to shake out as far as percentage of activities, but of course we're hearing opportunities and investment capital can be used to support entrepreneurs and growing businesses. There's drawbacks to both of those things. So for startups, the way the statute is written around acquisition date and substantial improvement, this works really well for startups. Investor appetite for startups, we don't know what that market looks like, so that's one thing around startups. Growth stage business expansion, we think that could be, or I've heard that could be another, great way to invest opportunity zone capital as well as franchising. Again, with the statute, there's some definitional issues around qualifying opportunity zone business and the acquisition date that we're going to need either clarity about or just further guidance on that could help us understand how we're defining improvement of those businesses so that we understand that existing businesses are qualified opportunity zone businesses. And again, happy to touch base during a later date on that as well. And part of that is also included in our blogs that we've done in the past. Real estate, so real redevelopment of commercial property, incubator space for entrepreneurs, mixed-use property, as well as housing, both market rate and affordable housing. Energy infrastructure, we're hearing that the time horizon for returns really aligns well with the 7 and 10 year benefits of opportunity zones. Brownfields redevelopment, for substantial improvement, it makes a lot of sense that the remediation would meet the substantial improvement test. So for the purchase price that you buy it for and the investment you make in remediation, that would help you meet the substantial improvement test very easily, as well as innovation districts. Next slide. The activities in cities and states and regions that we're of course seeing these convenings. I've selected just a few state convenings that we've seen pop up. There are many more that I've not listed here. We're seeing organizations come together to host joint events. So earlier this month, Enterprise partnered with PolicyLink and the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco to host an event, and the recording of that is linked there. We're seeing cities do some really cool things as far as one of the examples I want to elevate is the city of Norfolk in Virginia. They did an Opportunity Zones Day where they brought investors down to do both like an information session on opportunity zones, but also they hosted a tour with key sites and provided a lot of market data and information about those key sites. So I continue to hear the question, you know, where are the investable deals? And to the extent that cities can leverage information that they already have in hand to really point investors to where the deals are and then help them with that underwriting and due diligence process by handing over that data that they already have and probably, you know, their Chamber of Commerce or their Economic Development Department. I think that that just goes really far in creating an investable environment or attracting investors. Another example is this example in Ohio. NAIOP hosted an event around these publicly owned parcels and in conjunction with a city in Ohio. And what's really interesting about this is that this is all brownfield redevelopment, and it covered the incentives around redevelopment, the brownfield redevelopment, but these are all opportunity zones now. And so I'm listening at it as saying, you know, there may be these events already planned around publicly owned parcels or brownfield redevelopment where there's overlap with opportunity zones, and now is like a good time to be talking about opportunity zones as well during those meetings. And then Erie, Pennsylvania, I want to just say that they are launching a website for their opportunity zones, and that's going to house the future city prospectus, and they're estimating about $600 million in investable assets for their opportunity zones. For fund creation, we're seeing really exciting stuff in Birmingham, Alabama. I've heard that they're potentially doing a public-private partnership for a joint fund. That's not been confirmed to me, but I'm just saying that because I think that that's pretty clear the direction that they're going. Incentives and additional funding, that's another thing that cities and states are looking for or looking at. State treatment of capital gains. A number of states are already conforming with the federal level treatment of capital gains for opportunity zones, but then they're also looking how they can further enhance their state level treatment of capital gains in order to keep those dollars in their states. So it's those, you know, are you conforming with IRC? And if you are, then how are you further enhancing through additional exemption or deferral to incent capital to stay in your communities? As well as they're looking at how you're aligning existing funding sources with opportunity zones, and then new incentives and funding aligned with opportunity zones. So Missouri passed legislation for a special set-aside of state historic tax credits. And I also do want to elevate that Colorado is repurposing CDBG program income for eligible technical assistance and planning resources for activities around eligible opportunity zone fund management or planning. Next slide. And so based on what we're seeing, some recommendations that we want to offer to cities and states and regions is that really having a data-driven approach to policy making and community planning, understanding what your zones look like and creating that framework. So Memphis, for the first time in 4 decades, is doing a strategic planning process. And this is a great time for the city of Memphis to be thinking about how they're leveraging their assets and through land usage and zoning to align with opportunity zones, or at least be thoughtful about how that capital could come in and where they're incenting that capital to come in, and maybe where they're dissuading that capital from coming in through those different levers and mechanisms. And, you know, there are a number of cities like Washington, D.C. who already have small area plans in many of their communities, and that really is the framework for those communities that inform how opportunity fund investments could impact and will impact communities. And so it's continuing to point and redirect to those small area plans and engaging in similar planning processes. We did a blog on getting to know your zones as well, if folks are interested in that, and some of the resources we have. We have free 25-page reports on our mapping tool that Zach will talk about later that provide 150 data points on every single opportunity zone in the nation right now, and that's free. So it really is to help inform these policymaking decisions as well as how investors are thinking about where they're moving money and where the most need is. We really encourage cities and states to be thinking about how they're leveraging existing assets. Not all cities or states are in a position to offer additional incentives or to offer abatements or funding. And so how are you providing market data and information about community plans and highlighting investable deals? Because that is a value add to investors right now, and that is a value add to the marketplace. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be in the form of money or incentives. Another is to tie those incentives, if you are going to offer them, beyond year 10, so that you're preserving those incentives beyond any sort of exit out of an opportunity fund. What we wouldn't want to see is, investors exit out of an opportunity fund at year 10, and then the use of that building is changed and residents are displaced or businesses are displaced in order to achieve some return. And so it's about responsible exits. And to the extent you're doing a responsible exit and there was an initial incentive provided, how can you be preserving that incentive by structuring it on the front end to go beyond year 10? And then the last thing I'll say is really around creating certainty through adopted strategies or establishing an office. Investors are really looking for certainty when they're trying to find places to invest in. And if they don't know whether or not an incentive is going to be there next year, it may be difficult for them to plan a long-term strategy around your city or state. And one thing we're seeing now is some hesitancy given the 36 gubernatorial elections that are happening this year around investors moving to certain states because they don't know whether or not that state, how they're going to respond to opportunity zones if there's some change in governorship. So those are some initial thoughts based on how we're seeing cities and states respond to opportunity zones. And a really great resource I would now direct you to is how states can maximize opportunity zones, which was released by the Governance Project this summer. Next slide. And with that, for even more information on how states are responding, I do want to turn it over to Katie Kramer. Again, thank you, Katie, so much for joining us. And she is going to talk more about the State of the State report, which were released this summer, or I guess last week, right, Katie?
Yes, that's right.
Well,
Rachel,
thank you for joining us, and take it away.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Rachel, for that very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be with you and with Enterprise again. Thank you for hosting this conversation. It's a very important one as we're all trying to think through what is our proactive strategy around opportunity zones. For those of you who don't know, CDFA is a national nonprofit. We're based in Columbus, Ohio, but we work with state and local governments all across the country, helping them to better understand how to finance economic development. And what you see here on the screen is a really great example of that. This is Bakery Square in Pittsburgh, and this was a coordinated effort of the government there to leverage their public financing capacity to see even greater private sector investment. And they created a whole new redevelopment around this Bakery Square area. What I think is intriguing for our conversation today is that Bakery Square isn't in an opportunity zone, but right across the street is an opportunity zone. And this gets at where state and local governments are right now in trying to understand what they can be doing with their opportunity zone designations. How can they demonstrate the investment that has already occurred near a zone or around a zone and bring that into the next wave of investment and development and opportunity. We work with, as I said, state and local governments all across the country. And you can see here a map of where all the opportunity zones are in orange, overlaid with blue dots of where every different CDFA member is located. And some of these members are working to finance economic development in their state, across the country, in coordinated regions. And this shows really that investment activity and proactive opportunity zone strategies are going to need to occur all across the country. And to remind ourselves that what's important ultimately is what's on the ground, but that there's broad strategies at play, and to understand that is an important component of attracting investment to your zone. As Rachel mentioned, last week we released our State of the States report. This was a high-level look at where all of the states are in developing their opportunity zone strategies. It comes from 6 months of work coordinating directly with multiple state agencies through the nominations process and now into the designation and investment strategy process. We have been working with them. Many of them are our members naturally, and working with them now to understand how you finance economic development in your state, how you take that same level of activity and direct it to opportunity zones, and what that capacity looks like. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of time sharing with you what we've learned through this report. First and foremost, what's the pulse of opportunity zones? Where are states right now? How are they feeling? You'll see about 70% of the states rate their knowledge as intermediate. This is a really important place for everyone to understand, particularly investors, that states are still getting up to speed on this, that there's still a lot of questions that they have, and that they are still wanting to make sure that they are developing thoughtful strategies around opportunity zones and investments, and that this comes from truly the attitude on the ground of opportunity zones that you'll see, the majority of states think that opportunity zones have a mixed feeling or even an unsure feeling around what is an opportunity zone. What do we do with this? It's an important reminder for all of us that even if we might be working very specifically in just one zone, or very specifically with just one fund, that states have a very broad mandate. And to understand how this is affected across all of their policies, keeping in mind that still only 25% of their eligible low-income census tracts are opportunity zones, yet they're responsible for driving investment to their entire state, and recognizing that that's a very difficult mandate for them to balance and for them to be able to develop a strategy around. And so states truly are taking the long view in what this investment looks like over 10 years and hopefully beyond that, not just what does it look like to attract investment today or within the next few months. To address that, what are the different structures that state agencies are taking to be able to develop these strategies? You'll see about half of the states in this first graph here at the top are working directly with local communities. The other half, though, are seeing that there's not a specific role for their state, that they're structured in such a way that they see this tax incentive as being for a specific investor in a specific place, and that it should be governed by local communities. You'll see that stat goes very nicely with the one right below it. Will your state be hosting an educational event around this? Again, only about half the states right now are thinking about how they're coordinating all of their stakeholders across the board. Many truly do view this as a local tool, and that they should be making this possible for local communities to interact with that without having to have another level of state involvement. This also plays into what we're seeing here about how states are staffing opportunity zones. About a half of them already have a dedicated person responsible for building out their opportunity zone strategy at the state level and being a point person. The other half are still not quite sure how they're going to address this. Much of this is built around unease around what the gubernatorial elections may bring here in the fall. This also is around the very real situation that many states are not well resourced, and that providing an opportunity zone person is difficult for them to figure out how to pay for. This is not necessarily money that's guaranteed in their state. It is not money that's guaranteed to the state agency. And to be able to still figure out how to resource an opportunity zone strategy effectively is a difficult one for states. They have a very broad mandate, especially for development finance agencies and departments of commerce, to be able to manage all of the economic activity happening in their state, not only what's happening in their now newly designated opportunity zones. And this is a really important place for us to keep reminding ourselves states are looking at this for the long haul, and that they will need support from local communities and investors to be able to come into coordination for a long-term, broader economic development strategy when it comes to opportunity zones. So let's talk about that. What are some of the investment strategies that we're seeing right now coming from states? Many of them are thinking about the creation of incentives, and some of this might look like a companion incentive where their state capital gains taxes could be waived or deferred. Some of them are looking at special carve-outs of their tax credit allocation just for opportunity zone projects. Some of them are looking at providing additional scoring on existing incentive packages so that businesses or projects that are located in opportunity zones may receive a few additional points. And you can see about a third of the states have a solid idea of what that looks like right now. Everyone else is really still in an analysis process, trying to determine what this market looks like, where investors need support, and what their role is at the state agency in coordinating with the incentives that are needed locally on the ground. For states that are trying to think through what their investment strategy looks like, they are looking at what their pipeline of investable projects is, really driving down with local communities to determine different assets, different investment needs, different investment priorities, and how they can be building this pipeline for investors to be able to engage with them. And you can see, again, about a third of the states already feel very strong about their pipeline and what they're building. Many others are still trying to inform their strategy. The question I get asked the most, and you might be curious about this on the webinar as well, which states are looking at creating their own opportunity funds? What we know today, only about 18 to 20% of states are really thinking about raising their own opportunity fund. I think it's much more likely that states are going to look at how they can partner with an existing fund that is dedicated to their place or to their economic development goals. Many are looking at how they can just support other investments occurring rather than be that actual principal sponsor of a fund. What's most important, though, is that more than half of the states are already receiving routine communication from potential investors and opportunity fund managers. But when you think about this in context with which states have a dedicated opportunity zone staff, you see that this is very, very hard for them to balance, where most states don't have a dedicated staff person yet, though they're still trying to coordinate as best they can with the multitude of investors calling them seeking support. And our approach at CDFA has been to work with our members in figuring out what that balance is so that you can still have a proactive strategy and have a positive response to investors, even though you may not have a fully formed idea of what opportunity zone investments look like on the ground. So that brings me to share with you kind of insights that we've seen happening across the board in every state, in every community, and regardless of where you're located, I'd like for you to think about how you engage with some of these thoughts. First and foremost, not every opportunity zone will receive investment without local leadership, and this is leadership at all levels: state, city, county, region. Investors are actively seeking clear answers for where projects are located and how they can be a part of that. They're not going to pick every zone. You will have to be proactive in reaching out to them and leading them to understand what's possible in your community. You should be developing a strategy to identify where potential investments are and making that known to investors. And Rachel gave a variety of good examples when she was giving her overview of what we know today about opportunity zones. From our position at CDFA, and as we look at our expertise in financing economic development, our early research right now is showing that opportunity fund capital is really only going to meet about maybe 5 to 30% of a capital need for a project in an opportunity zone. This is critically important to recognize that opportunity fund capital is not going to be your saving grace. It is another tool in the toolbox. So let's not forget all of the other capital sources that are needed to successfully and sustainably finance a project. This is everything from debt capital, from other forms of incentives and federal programs, recognizing that cities and states may need to provide upfront infrastructure support in order for a project to succeed, recognizing that there's lots of other tools that need to be brought to bear, even if they're not directly in the capital stack. So, for instance, if you have a mixed-use retail project, you might have a lot of stores that you hope will locate on the ground floor of that project. You'll need to coordinate with all of the other local capital providers, banks, revolving loan funds, CDFIs, who can be that source of business financing so that the retailers or the business people locating in that real estate project is also a successful endeavor. That leads to a successful long-term real estate investment, which is what these investors are looking for right now. Long-term, recognizable, and responsible investment. Last but not least, identify projects that align with your local economic development strategies and clearly communicate that to investors. Help investors see what your priorities are so that they can be able to determine how best they can be investing alongside with you. Compel them to come forward so that you can have a thoughtful conversation around where you'd like to see investment occur in your opportunity zone, in your local community at large, within your state. And when you do that, encourage them to report what they're doing. It is our recommended practice at CDFA that incentives and additional forms of financing should not come to an opportunity zone project unless it's clear that that investor should be reporting their activities, what they're investing in, perhaps where they are hiring, what their long-term strategies are, so that states and locals can be able to report out some of the successes in their opportunity zone. This is an important time to remember the transparency conversation that Rachel shared with you at the beginning, that investors are not required to communicate where their investments are being made through opportunity funds. And that activity is already occurring, especially for single purpose or single asset investments. There is no requirement for an investor to be able to talk about what they're doing. This is a direct tax incentive to them and their business activities. So to be able to compel them to come forward through the use of additional incentives or supportive financing is a critical recommended practice for all different development finance agencies, regardless of your size or your location. And so with that, I'd like to invite you to be part of the conversation with us. CDFA and Enterprise and many other local partners are actively working on sharing consistent and clear information about opportunity zones. Next week, we're partnered with the Beck Center to host an event in Georgetown. I think that some of you are already planning to be there with us. This event is already oversubscribed, though you can sign up for the wait list. We'll have more than 200 communities joining us to talk this very issue. What is your local strategy around opportunity zones? How do you attract thoughtful and sustainable investment? If you're not able to join us in D.C., lots of other things that are happening right now. You might want to see us in Los Angeles, where we're talking about the direct strategies being played out there in Southern California. CDFA is really pleased to be in partnership with the Arizona Commerce Authority to host their statewide stakeholder meeting around opportunity zones. This is going to be at Arizona State University at the end of the month, end of September. And last but not least, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask you to please consider joining us for the CDFA National Summit in Dallas. We'll have a whole day of programming around opportunity zones, and you'll have a chance to see all of the other conversations about development finance tools that are essential for attracting investment into a zone. And so, Rachel, with that, I'll turn it back over to you, and I'll be pleased to answer questions when the time comes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie, and my thanks to you and CDFA for your continued leadership in this space. So speaking of getting engaged and learning more about opportunity zones, I think probably one of the best ways to begin that work is understanding the characteristics of opportunity zones and doing research. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Zach.
Thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Patton. I'm the Research Director for the Knowledge, Impact, and Strategy team at Enterprise. And I also lead much of the development of Opportunity 360, which is our approach to understanding and improving outcomes using cross-sector data, engagement, and interactive tools like the one I'll be showing you a bit later today. We launched our website at the end of last year and have some of our initial tools and case studies up there for you to explore and use, including the Opportunity Zones Eligibility tool, which I know many of you have been using over the last several months throughout the Opportunity Zones designation process and the period we're in now where we're asking questions and trying to understand what those designations mean for our communities and our portfolios. So if you haven't checked out our site, I encourage you to do so at www.opportunity360.org. To that end, I would like to do two things with my time today. First, I'm going to be giving a few observations about what we know about the types of people and places that comprise opportunity zones now that we have the full picture of designated zones. And so that'll provide a nice backdrop for thinking about and diving into the report that Katie just described for us. And second, I'm going to be giving you a preview of the new tool that we're going to be releasing to replace our current Opportunity Zones Eligibility tool, which you can use to further explore these issues. So with that said, what do we know about opportunity zones now that we know the universe of opportunity zones? Well, for one thing, we know that this is a program that affects a whole lot of people. There are nearly 8,800 zones that are census tracts across the states and territories that are home to over 35 million people, which is about 12% of all census tracts and 11% of the total population of the U.S. and the territories. And then there are, of course, all the other folks who are investors, employees at businesses in those places, and so forth, who don't necessarily live in the zones, but who are potentially going to be impacted by this program. So we're really talking about a lot of folks that will be, that could be touched by this program. So what do we know about the types of places that were designated? The biggest take home, I would say, is that there's a lot of variation, both among states and among zones. So I'm going to talk about some general trends, but I think, honestly, the best way to understand what opportunity zones look like is to pick a few, maybe ones that are near you or that are places that maybe you've had encounters with, and take a deep look at what those places look like, and I'll show you how to do that using some of our tools today. So thinking about things on a national basis or an average basis, 3/4 of opportunity zones are located in metropolitan areas. That may seem high, but that's actually a bit lower than what would have been proportional given the set of census tracts that were eligible. So believe it or not, this actually indicates a slight preference for zones that were not located in metropolitan areas, at least in some states. There are a pretty wide variety of place types that have been designated. So as you look at a map nationally or within most states, you'll find a good mix of urban, suburban, rural areas. There are almost 300 zones that contain Native American lands, which is roughly proportional to the number of those areas generally across the country. So really a wide variety of places that you'll see. One thing that was somewhat surprising to us as we looked at the final designations is that only about 2% of all the opportunity zones that were designated qualified on the basis of being contiguous tracts, which, as many of you know, states were allowed to designate up to 5% of their opportunity zones on the basis of being contiguous with or adjacent to the low-income community tracts that were opportunity zones. So that allowed for some higher income tracts to be designated if they were adjacent. And so a lot of folks were wondering if states would really try to maximize those designations, since those might be areas that are higher income, potentially offer higher investment returns. So the fact that states chose not to designate as many of those higher income areas, and in some states chose not to designate any at all, so that was something that we didn't necessarily expect to see. And actually, in fact, the trend nationally was that it was actually in the opposite direction, that the average opportunity zone has lower incomes, higher poverty rates, lower home values and rents, lower home ownership rates, and higher levels of cost burden. And that's not just in comparison to the national average, that's also in comparison to the other low-income communities and contiguous tracts that could have been designated but weren't. So whether these were explicit factors in states' decision-making, we certainly see a consistent pattern in the outcome of those designations, which is that the opportunity zone designations really focused on tracts where more people are struggling economically. A few states probably break that mold on some of these issues, but it's really surprisingly consistent across most states. We also see some racial differences between residents in the opportunity zones versus those in other tracts in the state. So you can see in the chart there at the bottom of this slide, the orange bars there in the chart show designated zones. The blue bars are tracts that were eligible to be designated but weren't actually designated. So the dark blue are the low-income communities. The lighter blue are the contiguous tracts. And then the gray bars are the tracts that were never eligible for designation. So you can really see across each of those racial categories that there's kind of this trend of opportunity zones being a bit different than low-income communities that are in turn a bit different from contiguous tracts and ineligible tracts. And that kind of pattern where you see this, slope in one direction or another occurs in a large number of the indicators we've looked at to sort of look at these zones. So in this case, you can see that the average designated opportunity zone has a much lower share of white residents and a higher share of Black or African American residents and Hispanic Latino residents than each of the other categories of tracts across the country. And this pattern of differences between those zones and the other types of tracts in the state is something that you'll be able to explore with the tool that I'll show you in just a moment. So in addition to thinking about the types of people and places opportunity zones represent, one of the things that we've been paying close attention to is how opportunity zones relate to other programs and policies. So part of our recommendations for folks during the designation process was to look at how opportunity zones might reinforce existing place-based investment strategies, with the idea that opportunity funds might be more likely to produce social benefits in areas where thought is already being put into community development, affordable housing creation, and preservation, and other goals that you might see with other existing place-based programs. So one of the interesting findings is that there's a substantial amount of overlap between opportunity zones and the nation's affordable housing stock. So we find that about 70% of opportunity zones across the 50 states and D.C. already have federally assisted housing units located in them, and these collectively comprise more than a quarter of all federally assisted housing in the country. So over 25% of all federally assisted housing units in the country are located in opportunity zones. And that's a significantly higher kind of proportion than in either of the other, any of the other kind of categories of tracts. So, that represents a pretty significant potential for opportunity and fund investments to align with affordable housing strategies in many places. And this is also a clear bright spot for those who are concerned about potential displacement that could arise from these investments. So, because it means that there's at least some buffer against some of the displacement pressures that people are concerned about. In addition, we find that opportunity zones are more likely to be target areas for other federal place-based programs compared to both tracts in general and compared to low-income communities that could have been designated, as you see in the chart below. And in case you can't read the small print there on the slide, going from left to right, the first cluster shows CDBG projects. The second one is qualified census tracts. The third shows where tracts intersect with promise zones, and then choice neighborhoods, and then empowerment zones. So in orange there are designated opportunity zones. So you can see that the designated zones are much more likely to be members of those federal target areas for different programs and policies, at least across this selection. So, given that that was one of our recommendations, we consider this to be a great outcome of the designation process. So, having just thought a bit about the picture nationally, how can you learn more about what opportunity zones look like and what they might mean for you where you live and work? Today I'm going to be giving you a quick look at a new tool that we're going to be releasing in the coming days to replace the existing Opportunity Zones eligibility tool that we have on our website currently. That tool, as you may know, we originally developed to help folks understand the designation process, but now that that designation process is over, we wanted to switch gears a bit and give people a different tool set for looking at zones that have been designated rather than the eligibility landscape. So this new tool we're calling the Opportunity Zone Explorer, and we think you'll find it useful as you seek to understand these new geographies. And I should emphasize that it is not yet live. When it does go live in the coming days, we'll make an announcement on our Opportunity 360 Twitter feed, which is at Op360, OPP360. And then we'll also send around a link to the page in our follow-up email from the webinar that will include the slides and so forth. So let me pull that up here so I can share it with you. Okay. So here's the page, which looks similar. It's on our Opportunity 360 site. Looks similar to the old tool. So you'll see some explanatory text at the top, which I will let you read on your own time. So the tool itself, you'll notice immediately some differences between this tool and the last one. For one thing, you'll see a national map instead of a state-level map. And it shows the opportunity zones that have been designated there in orange. One new feature we've added, which we think you'll like, is the ability to search the map for a city or county or a zip code of interest. So you can use this to zoom the map to wherever you'd like and see where opportunity zones in that area might be. So I can click this little magnifying glass and type a location, and then the map will zoom to the location, and I'll be able to view opportunity zones that have been designated there. In addition, we've reworked the tooltips. So if you mouse over track to see, before you would get information about the eligibility status, here you're getting information about the overlap with federal programs, since, as I mentioned, that's kind of we think an important consideration. And then you'll also see our Opportunity 360 outcome index values, which give you an indication of the outcomes that residents of this zone are attaining. In addition, at the bottom of the tooltip, you'll see a link to open the Opportunity 360 report for this tract, which is the 25-page report that Rachel mentioned. So I can pull up an example here so you can see that. So this is a report that you can print out and take with you. You can view it online, and I don't have time to go into the whole report today, but you can see from the table of contents here, we have information about neighborhoods, about buildings and housing markets, and about the people who live there. So you can scroll down in the report. You can also click on any of these categories to go to that section and learn more about what this tract looks like and how it compares to the region and so forth. So returning to the tool, another new feature is that I can now, if I zoom back out, I can now select a group of tracts and pull up a list of those tracts. So let's say I'm interested in exploring the characteristics of a certain set of opportunity zones in Maryland. So maybe I can zoom to Maryland. And let's say that I'm interested specifically in this set here in Central Maryland. So you can see I selected a few tracts, and then I'm getting the option to see a list of the selected tracts. In this case, I only selected 2, but I could select as many as I liked. And so that'll pull up a list so that I could, find out more information about those or use them in my analysis or whatever I was doing. So as I scroll down in the page here, you'll see a list of filters that I can apply to the map. For now, these are the same set of filters that we had in the original tool, so I won't spend too much time looking at these, but we are going to be adding new information to this over time so that you can kind of filter on different characteristics. But for now, the choices you have are really focused on where the tract is located, so I could just look at tracts in a specific state or one or more states, a specific county, and so forth. I can look at the overlap with federal place-based program, and I can look at the Opportunity 360 outcome indices and look at tracts that score high or low on those indices. Another new feature of the Explorer tool is this arrow at the top right of the tool. So if I can click that and open a new view of the information that allows you to compare designated opportunity zones with other tracts in each state. So this will create charts that are similar to the ones that I had in my slides. So right now we're looking at Alabama, and I can select a different state from this drop-down list to see how a different state fares on these metrics. I can also choose up to 3 variables to populate these charts here from a long list of variables that we've included here, so that you can explore how sort of the outcomes of different states' designation processes. So we can look, right now we're looking at poverty rate on the top, median household income here, and the percent of units that are owner-occupied in the middle. And so I can see how the designated zones relate to low-income communities, contiguous tracts that were eligible, and then tracts that were never eligible to begin with in the state. And, as I choose states, I see maybe different patterns based on each state's designation process. So I'll leave it there today, but be on the lookout for this tool this week, as well as other additional features that we are working on that we will be adding to this tool as we finish them. So this will be kind of an evolving tool that we hope you'll find to be a useful resource for you as you seek to understand how opportunity zones are likely to affect your communities and businesses and places that you care about. And with that, I will turn things back over to Rachel to wrap things up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Zach, and thanks to you and your team for all your hard work and updating the map and thinking through what's going to be most useful for people as we move forward. So I know we said 20 minutes for questions. I'm happy to stick around a little bit longer. So Donna, I don't know if we want to open it up for Q&A, but before we do that, just want to share a little bit more of additional information. Again, Enterprise Community Partners, we have our Opportunity Zones website. Again, we have a new Opportunity Zones guide out that is listed. Please keep an eye out for the map that Zach just shared, plus, of course, our blogs and archived webinars and additional announcements all on that website. CDFI Fund, their website is still a really great resource, especially their mapping tool is great. Economic Innovation Group, please visit their website for more information. They have really great state fact sheets now, so you could go to their website and grab a state fact sheet for opportunity zones. Of course, Council of Development and Finance Agencies, Katie's organization, their resource page is where you can find that State of the State reports, plus much, much more. If you need to get a hold of Zachary, those are our email addresses. Please feel free to reach out, and we can either answer your questions or redirect you to those that are better positioned to. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us that has to jump and open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. The good news is we have lots of great questions, and of course the bad news is that we have lots of great questions. So if we're not able to get to your question, I do apologize. I'll make sure that both Rachel and Zach get a copy of all the questions that have been submitted along with your respective email addresses. So if we need to get back to you, we will certainly do so. So with that, let's jump in. Our first question is, some projects have multiple buildings in different locations. How would a project be impacted if one of the locations is in an opportunity zone and the other location is not?
Yeah, so what I'll say is we get very often very specific questions, project-specific questions that, you know, I have to say, please talk to your legal team, please talk to your accountant, please talk to your fund structuring team to the extent that you might have one of those. I can answer very general questions. I would hesitate to want to answer very specific questions, but I could take a stab at that one in saying that only the way that you would want to think about that, and we get this question a lot because it's analogous to, say, infrastructure like broadband access, or how can you use opportunity zones to invest in broadband. So my guess, and again guess, would be that you could still structure a capital fund that would look like a qualified opportunity zone fund that you could invest in that property, but only the portion of it that would be eligible for the benefit would be associated with the one building. So I would probably structure it differently and maybe do a special purpose vehicle with just that one asset to the extent that you could, but I think that might be difficult. So you just might want to think about different structuring techniques because only the one building that is located in the opportunity zone would be eligible to receive the benefit associated with the capital invested.
Okay, our next question. Do the opportunity zones have entities, and do these entities approve or disapprove of certain investment projects?
So opportunity zones was meant to be a very market-driven policy design. So there's no oversight at the local, state, or federal level. So there's no government oversight regarding what types of investments are being made beyond what's written in the statute and what could potentially be added through regulations. So really the only level of oversight we would have regarding what investments could be made is how a fund manager is certifying. So whether a fund could operate as an opportunity fund, and what we're seeing is that they don't need IRS approval before they do so. And so they're basically self-certifying, so it's back end that they're certifying. And then there's no sort of, and before I invest in the community, I have to get approval from the city or state. There's not that level of oversight there either. And so there's no entity that is approving investments, approving projects, approving investments into businesses. It is very much a private market approach to community investment.
Okay. Our next question is actually in 3 parts. Has anyone made progress on twinning opportunity zones with LIHTC? Would this bring many new investors to the LIHTC market? And would appreciated value of the property need to accrue to the investor in order for them to get maximum opportunity zone benefits?
I can answer the part about whether or not this has happened, and I will say that my understanding is PNC has made an investment into a LIHTC property that has included opportunity fund capital as well. I'm not sure what the structuring of that looks like, so I'm not sure how they accrued the benefit, or I'm not sure how the return or the benefit accrued to the investor. But what I do know is that it was PNC who, they were both the investor and the fund manager, so they invested their own capital gain. They created a fund, incorporated a fund to do that, and then they invested into a LIHTC property. So that is an example where that has successfully been done. What I would earmark and flag for folks is that there's not been any sort of ruling around whether or not opportunity zone investments are eligible CRA activities. And so that's another thing that remains out there as a question, is about whether financial institutions or folks that have CRA mandates, whether these sorts of investment activities would qualify for CRA investment credit. And so that's just one thing to note as financial institutions are moving forward and making these types of investments.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how are funds being created and projects started when final rules have not yet been implemented? Are they just being set up and holding capital until clarification is provided? What are the risks or benefits to this approach?
So what you're seeing groups like, and I'll cite Fundrise. Fundrise is a crowdfunding platform for real estate and equity, crowdfunding platform for real estate investment that has been around for a few years, and their theory really is around the democratization of real estate investment and opening that up to more than just traditional high net worth individuals or institutional investors. And they launched, and they have very low minimums, investment minimums, something around like $10,000 is what I'm hearing for their opportunity fund. And they launched last week, so folks can go on their website. It's fundrise.com, and really what they've said is that they are sticking as close to the statute as possible, and so they're not taking liberties at all with their structuring or their modeling or their activities that they're engaging in. So they know what the zones are, they know they have to self-certify, and then they're staying very close to what is written, and then assuming that the IRS is not going to write any rules that are necessarily prohibitive or at odds with their operations. This was already part of Fundrise's business model to, leverage investor capital, third-party investor capital to invest in real estate in growing markets, and so it's not necessarily outside of their business model to be doing this anyways. So that's why I think that they were able to quickly leverage this opportunity and move forward with it. There's pretty heavy disclosures to their investors that there's risks associated with making investments, period, but also risks associated with any sort of additional rules or regulations that may be forthcoming. So investors, basically, when they read their offering memorandum or PPM, understand and have to understand the risks that they're taking on, and they're doing that through those disclosures. But that's with third-party investors. But other firms, like I just mentioned, some financial institutions are investing their own capital gains by creating their own funds. That's internal decision-making around whether or not they're willing to take on that risk of investing those capital gains, knowing that they may be at odds with future regulations and may be penalized or the benefit may be rescinded because they are at odds. And so it's just a matter of, whether or not that risk makes sense to you or not. That being said, I think that is a short-term strategy, and really if we want to see a very robust marketplace and we want to see innovation occur and we want to see funds doing activities that wouldn't otherwise occur, we really do need to see additional guidance and clarity from the IRS, because that's what's holding up a lot of folks that want to do really interesting things, I think.
Great, thank you. As noted, we are running past the hour. Let's try and get a couple more questions in, and then just a reminder that if you can't stay, we are going to make sure that our panelists get all the questions that have been submitted. So let's go to the next question. Is the Treasury the only regulating entity for opportunity zones, or are there others? Can states and local governments put additional regulations in place that are more demanding than those from the feds?
So, Katie, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say and what you've heard. My understanding is that Treasury and the IRS really are, for the federal, especially at the federal level, the only regulating agency. And then when it comes to states and localities, really their only point of leverage is around, land use planning and how they allocated zones, as far as if they wanted to prohibit certain activities, which is what I'm guessing the question was really getting at. And if it wasn't, I apologize. But I don't know if states or localities could necessarily prohibit opportunity fund investments, and I don't think that would be politically popular, just based on a lot of the feedback that we're hearing. But I do know that the concern about fund investment and how that's happening is shared amongst a lot of groups. So, Katie, do you have any insights on that?
Sure. I'll add, as a reminder, this is a federal tax incentive for federal capital gains. And so the IRS will effectively, through its annual tax and audit process, require funds to fill out basic forms to prove that their tax should continue to be deferred. Or the federal capital gains tax should continue to be deferred. At the local level, states who might want to add additional incentives or perhaps provide, a deferral on state capital gains taxes could add a layer of regulation only to access that incentive, but not necessarily to change what the federal government allows for. At the state and local levels, there's lots of other ways that they can use their regulatory power in terms of changing zoning requirements or aligning other types of kind of procedures in order for developers or business people to be able to receive that type of investment. But for the most part, in all of our work with CDFA members across the country, they're not interested in disrupting an investment process. They're very much wanting to attract sustainable capital to their local areas that are designated opportunity zones, and there's no regulatory body there that will stop or alter how that investment occurs.
Great, thank you both. Let's go for our final question of the afternoon. At several public forums, there's been a large concern about gentrification in the low-income areas where the zones are located. Can you speak to this?
Yes, I will echo that we've also heard loud and clear a concern around gentrification and displacement based on increased investment in opportunity zones. And this is where I really point to the importance of understanding the characteristics of opportunity zones, and where I think public sector leadership is critical right now. And in saying that, part of the really great work that our knowledge team has done is they've identified, broad strokes schemes, as Zach had shared, but one of the metrics that they've been able to pull is that, a third of residents living in opportunity zones are paying more than half of their income on rent. And so we know that there are a large swath of residents that are going to be very susceptible to housing shocks or are vulnerable for displacement should increased investment occur, and that has an impact on rental pricing or property taxes, et cetera. And so what I think it's really important to do as next steps for stakeholders living in communities that feel like, that they may be susceptible to gentrification or displacement is to be talking with public sector leaders about, all right, you nominated our community to be an opportunity zone. You are potentially considering additional incentives to bring capital into these zones. On the other hand, what additional resources are you then also committing to these zones to ensure that affordable housing is preserved, affordable housing is created, so that there is that inclusive economic growth, so that residents that are paying half of their income on rent can stay in place and benefit from that positive trend with that investment. And so it's really, I think, an early policy decision around resources that needs to be made now, and I think that's the conversation that needs to be happening. And then especially where you have opportunity zones where there's a high likelihood that activity is going to occur no matter what, I think it's important to think about inclusionary zoning policies and overlays. And if it's an area that very likely will have a lot of market rate apartments that are going to receive this tax benefit, what additional inclusionary zoning boosts or overlays could be added to that zone where it's not going to be prohibitive because the market's going to come no matter what, but that way you're getting, 10 or 20 affordable homes through that IZ policy. So I think that's sort of how communities have to think about it, because like as Katie mentioned, there's no real mechanism to say opportunity funds cannot invest in our community. I don't think we're going to get there, but I think it's just through really thoughtful policy-making decisions that are informed by data, such as the types of data that Enterprise is offering, and very strategic, directive resource alignment. Some of this can be solved for, but it has to be thought about now before investments begin to be made, because if you think about it, 5 years from now, it's just too expensive to deal with.
Great, thank you. And again, just a reminder, if we didn't get to your question, they will all be sent to our panelists for their responses. And with that, Rachel, do you have any final wrap-up words for us?
No, I just want to really thank Zach and Katie for their great work and for joining me today, and Donna for you, of course, for hosting us as always. And for everyone who's joined us, since January, but on the call today, we really are grateful that we get the opportunity to be a resource for you all, and we hope that you continue to visit our webpage and we continue to be able to provide the type of content that's helping you do your job and helping you stay up to date on opportunity zones. So, continue to look for updates from us, and as always, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to everyone joining us today. We hope to see you online again soon. Goodbye.